Hello, novice designers and seamstress alike. My name is Shalita, and I am the owner of That's So Creative. And I'm super excited today because we are starting our first sewing series, and our first project will be this wine bottle carrier here. I'm super excited to walk you guys through the process. It's super easy, and I can guarantee, even if you've never touched a machine, you'll be able to say, I can't believe I made that. I have the PDF pattern of this carrier on my website. You can find it on www.thatsocreative.com under our PDFs, and let's hop into it. So for our materials, what you're going to need first is the PDF pattern, which can be found on my website, of the wine bottle carrier. So we have 2 pieces pre-cut out already of the outside layer with the pattern prints. Then you're going to need to cut out 2 pieces of the lining, which I have this red fabric here. And then we'll also need 2 pieces of medium weight interfacing, which I also have here. And then you can choose to use either scissors. I use a rotary cutter for ease. Then you'll have some pins and then your iron. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna cut out our pattern piece. I have a folded piece of the red fabric, so it's 2 layers here, okay? And then I make sure to pin them down so that the fabric doesn't shift. Now, if you're using your pattern piece, you can do the same thing, just add pins or weights to your top pattern piece so that it stays into place. Now, helpful tip, if you are right-handed and you are using a rotary blade, what you want to do is make sure that you're always cutting on the right side of your fabric, okay? Now, once you get here, you're also going to stay on the right side. The reason you want to do that is because if the blade is on the right, I can see the fabric on the left. If I start to cut this way, I only see the blade, but I don't see the fabric on the other side. And that could cause you to end up cutting into the fabric or cutting too far away from the pattern piece. All right, so let's get this cut out. Now that we have our red fabric cut out, now all you need to do is cut out your interfacing. So we're going to move our interfacing over here. I'm going to lay down my other piece here. We can also add pins so that it doesn't shift. I'm just going to add a couple pins here just to keep it in place. Now when you do your pins, you want to go into the fabric and then back up. So I'm coming down into that fabric and then flipping my pin back upward. Okay, and then just make sure that your fabric is straight. And then we can cut out our pieces again like we did our lining pieces. And I'm just being careful around those curves, making sure that I don't accidentally cut into the fabric onto our pattern piece. And we're gonna go all the way around. And then the same thing, we can take our scissors here to cut those square corners out. And you may be wondering, why do we have square corners? Well, you're definitely going to find out as we start to put this together, because this is actually what's going to help the bag to stand on its own. So now we have all of our pieces cut out, and now it's time to iron our interfacing to our pieces, and then we'll take it to the machine. So before we iron our interfacing to our fabric, it's one thing that we need to know. Interfacing actually has two sides. This is an iron-on interfacing, so the front side is smooth, but if I flip this over, the back side is actually a little rough and bumpy. That's because this is the side that has the adhesive. So when we iron, we want to make sure that the bumpy side is actually facing down onto the fabric. If it is facing up and then your iron on top of it, it's definitely going to stick to your iron, and we do not want that. This is the bumpy side, and this is the incorrect side of the fabric. So I'm going to flip this over so that the bumpy side is facing down and match up our pattern piece. Okay. Now that it's matched up, I'm going to grab my iron, and my iron is on medium heat, not too hot. And what we're going to do is we're going to press down on the fabric. So a lot of people actually don't know that there is a difference between ironing and pressing. So when we press down on the fabric, we're literally just pressing down. If I start to iron and start to shift this fabric, what is going to happen is that the interfacing is going to start to slide and move in different positions, and we don't want that. So we'll just hold it down on the fabric just for a few seconds and then move over to a different area until we cover the whole piece. Okay, and then just make sure you really get your corners so that they don't lift. And just press it down all the way around. And now we have ironed it on, and you'll notice that it adds a little bit of extra weight. Now the interfacing that I'm using here is just a lightweight interfacing, but you can also use a medium weight interfacing depending on the kind of fabric that you're using. This is just a lightweight cotton. So if I wanted my bag to be just a little bit sturdier, I can use a heavier interfacing. I just chose to use the lighter one, but in the details, I will give you some options for some different interfacing to use. Once you iron this piece, then you're gonna go and iron the other side of the outside fabric with the interfacing as well. First thing we're gonna do before we start sewing is actually line up our fabric and add our pins. So what's really important, if you have a printed fabric, you want to make sure that the facing or the correct side of the fabric with the print is actually facing inward to each other. So we're just going to line these two pieces up with the print on the inside. So we'll actually be sewing on the incorrect side of the fabric. The first part that we're going to sew is this top piece here straight across using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, what is a seam allowance? What does that mean? Basically, it means that you are sewing a 1/2 inch in from the edge of this fabric. If it's helpful, you can use a ruler to mark your seam allowance. So for instance, I'll mark a 1/2 inch with my chalk pencil here, and then another 1/2 inch here. And then I can connect my dots. You can also use a seam gauge to be able to mark your seam allowance straight across. And I'll also show you as we get on the sewing machine how to actually use the lines on the sewing machine to measure your seam allowance. Now, as I said before, we're actually going to pin our two fabric pieces together. You can add maybe 1 or 2 pins here. We're just going to add a pin straight down into that fabric, and then this way. Now, what's really important when it comes to actually adding your pins is you want to make sure that your pins are actually perpendicular to the direction that you're going to be sewing. So if I'm sewing left to right, my pins need to be facing north and south, okay? If I was sewing north and south, then my pins will be facing east to west. And that's just going to help you a lot, especially when you start sewing, to make sure that you can easily pull out those pins before you end up sewing on top of it. And if you do end up sewing on top of it, then your needle hopefully will just skip over it a lot better versus hitting the pin and possibly breaking your needle or messing up your fabric. So now we're gonna slide our fabric under our presser foot, lining up the right side of the fabric to our 1/2 inch line, push it in slightly past our needle point, and then we're gonna put our presser foot down. Now I'm gonna go ahead and lower our needle into our fabric, and then we're gonna sew a straight line right down to the other side of this handle. Now before I get to the needle, we're gonna go ahead and pull it out. And I'm gonna sew down just a few stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch back to the beginning and then sew all the way down. Once I get to the other side, we're also going to do another back stitch. Now we're going to raise our needle and raise our presser foot and pull out our fabric and then cut our threads. All right, then once we do this to this side, we're also going to do the same thing to our lining piece. So now that we have our 1/2 inch seam allowance sewn, now what we're going to do is open up our fabric and lay it down flat. And then we want to just use our fingers to open up our seam allowance. And we're going to press it down flat, and then we're going to use our iron to iron our seam open. And you're going to do the same thing on your lining piece. Now that we have our seam allowances pressed open, what we're going to do is we're going to take our top fabric and lay it straight down onto our lining fabric. Okay, so you should see the incorrect sides of both. I should see the seam allowance on this side, and if I flip it, I shall also see the seam allowance on this side of the lining fabric. Then you want to add some pins going all the way around just the curved edge for the handle, and then you're going to add some pins on the opposite side going around the curve. And now we're going to add a seam on both sides just into that curve. That's about 1/2 inch. If you want your handle to be slightly wider, you can also use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to start on the right side of the fabric, right at the bottom of that curve, and we're going to come in, back stitch, okay, and then come all the way around. Now, what I'm going to do when I'm going around those curves, I'm actually going to take my hands and I'm shifting the fabric to the left, okay, until it works all the way around that curve. If it's easier, what you can do is make sure your needle is down first, raise your presser foot, and then slightly turn your fabric, and then put your presser foot back down. Okay, again, we're going to shift that fabric all the way around. If we need to, make sure our needle is down. Give it a slight turn, and then keep working it around. Once you get to that other edge, we're going to do another back stitch. There you have it. And we'll do the same thing to the other side. Now you still want to make sure that the seam allowance here in the center is flat and pressed down, and we're going to sew right over it. Make sure it goes down, slightly turn it, press your foot back down so you get all the way around, and then we'll do our back stitch. All right, so once you do that to both sides, then now what we're going to do is actually add some clips into our sewn curves. So this area here, we're just going to take our scissors and add some slight snips up until your stitch line, but you're not snipping through your stitch line. Now, whenever you're sewing curves, you want to make sure to add snips into your seam allowance because it's going to help your fabric lay flat once you flip it inside out. So just add some snips all the way around till you get back to the other side. And then you're going to do the same thing to the opposite side. You're going to add your snips in. Now, if you actually have a pair of snippers, those will be really useful to use. But if not, just use your scissors. Just be really careful when you add your snips around. Okay? And you can see that the fabric is cut there. Now, if I wanted to actually lay this flat, you can actually see that it'll lay flat with the snips in it. Versus the opposite side, if I try to lay this flat, then there's a lot of folds and tension in it. So that's why we want to add our snips right into that seam allowance. So now that we have both of our curves sewn, what we're going to do now is flip this inside out straight through this opening of the handle. So I'm just going to reach in and just scrunch in this fabric as much as possible. Now it may be a little tough, but just reach in and try to push out as much fabric as you can. Okay, and I'm just using my fingers to tuck that fabric through that hole of the handle. Okay, and I'm using my fingers to just reach in and just kind of pull it out. Now this part, you may need a little bit of patience, especially if you used a bigger seam allowance, then that means that this opening is a little bit smaller, so it may be a little harder to get through. But I promise it's not impossible. All right, so now we fully have it through, and it should look just like this. So you should see the finished side of the handle on both sides. And then our next step, what we're going to do, this part is a little bit tricky, but we're just going to take both ends of the printed side and we're going to sandwich them together. And then we're going to sandwich both sides of the lining. We're going to add our pins. Okay, and then you're going to do the opposite side the exact same way. Now what we're going to do is sew straight across this bottom edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once we finish that, then we're going to come straight down the side. And remember, when you first start, you always want to backstitch. Now we're coming down the right side of the bag. Make sure to backstitch. Now make sure that this fabric, if it starts buckling up, so this is where the handle is, you want to make sure that this handle is tucked towards the center of this fabric so that you don't end up sewing on top of it. Making sure that the seam allowance here is laying flat, and just sew right over it. Now we're going to come back on the printed side, straight down that bottom area again. Now, for this side, we're going to come straight down, all the way down our printed side, but we're actually going to end up stopping at this first blue pin. What we want to do is leave open just a slight opening here, because this is actually the hole that we're going to use to be able to flip our bag completely inside out. So we'll start at the top of the fabric side, so all the way down to this blue pin, back stitch, and then we're going to hop over to this other blue pin, do a little back stitch here, and then sew all the way down to the corner. Making sure that it's open and flat. We're going to sew all the way down to this blue pin. Okay, and then now we're going to start back at this blue pin and sew all the way down to the end. I'm going to move my pin out the way. Start right back right there. So now we're going to talk about these squared corners. So the first thing that we want to do is just pinch right in where this corner is on both sides, and then I'm just going to pull it out straight. Okay, if I turn it this way, so you'll see, so I'm pushing this top seam allowance to the left, and then on the bottom side, I'm gonna push this top seam allowance to the right, okay? So this should be stretched all the way out. Now it's straight across the top, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to our sewing machine, and we're gonna sew from left all the way to the right side using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you're gonna do the same thing for all corners. So you wanna make sure that your fabric is completely flat, okay? And there's no folds under it. And again, we're gonna start from one side and sew all the way over to the other side. And that is how you sew your squared corner. Now, if I was to pull at our seam allowance here, just pull those corners back out. Now you notice that it's formed into a flat bottom. Okay, so now this bag should actually be able to stand up. Now we're taking it back to the machine, and I want to show you that if you just take your fingers and kind of just press this along the seam edge so that it's flat, this will make it a lot easier when it's time to take it to your machine. Now what you can also do is go ahead and just add a pin to hold these two sides closed, okay? Now this is where the hole starts and this is where it stops. So I'm just gonna go slightly above and below this hole, do a small back stitch, so close to this folded edge all the way down, and then do another small back stitch there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and move my needle position over slightly to the right, and then I'm going to line my fabric up, just noting where the opening starts, which is here. So we're gonna push it up just a tad, okay? And notice we're sewing super close to this edge. And what you also want to make sure is actually that the outside fabric is not folded into this edge, because we only want to sew this lining. So what you can do also is just pull this top fabric out the way, just to make sure that it doesn't get caught here while you're sewing. And we're going to line this back up, lower our needle, do a small back stitch, and then stitch all the way down to where that hole ends. Now as you can see, this is our stitch here that's closing our lining. Now if you are okay with seeing the stitch here, just make sure that you use a thread that is closest to the color of your lining so that it doesn't show as much. So now that we have our lining stitch closed, you just want to make sure to go through, make sure that all of your threads are cut off, and then here's the final reveal. We're just going to flip everything inside out. Make sure, just take your fingers and push those corners out. Okay. All right. And here we are, your very own wine bag carrier. Okay, so now let's see if the bottle actually fits. So this is a 750 milliliter bottle of wine. And so you just slip it right through the side, this opening here, slip it right through there and down. And look at that. It fits, it fits. Oh my gosh, so this is actually really perfect for gifts, especially around the holidays. You know, make it for yourself, make it for your girlfriends, bridal showers, bachelor parties, whatever you want to make it for. But again, this is super simple, and I hope that you guys were able to follow along and that you absolutely love this video. Please feel free to subscribe and like. We will really appreciate it. And we have so many great new projects that will be coming up. Thanks for following.